In the beginning, there was a quiet street lined with elm trees and a large Victorian house whose windows caught the first pale gold of morning. The town was Oak Park, Illinois, a place of wide lawns and wooden porches, where the sound of a horse-drawn carriage drifted slowly down the lane. This was where Ernest Hemingway first opened his eyes to the world, in a home filled with books and the smell of polished wood. His mother, Grace, a musician, would sometimes play the piano in the parlor, and the notes would float softly through the rooms like dust motes in the sunbeams. Outside, the garden was a tangle of summer flowers, heavy with dew at dawn. The boy would wake early, drawn to the window, watching the light change on the shingled roofs of the neighbors' houses. It was a life of gentle rhythms, of breakfast smells, and the rustle of turning pages. His father, Clarence, was a physician, a man who loved nature and took young Ernest into the woods and along the banks of the Des Plaines River. On those slow afternoons, the forest was a cathedral of green light, the canopy filtering the sun into soft, shifting patterns on the forest floor. The boy learned to be still, to watch a heron lift from the water, to listen to the quiet tick of insects in the tall grass. These were lessons in observation, in noticing the smallest details, the way a leaf curled at the edge, the precise color of the river at dusk. He would carry this patience into his writing years later, the ability to see clearly without rushing. In that Midwest woodland, everything felt slow and eternal, as if time itself rested under the great oaks. Inside the Hemingway home, the library was a sanctuary. Tall shelves reached to the ceiling, filled with volumes of history, travel, and the classics. Late in the afternoon, with the golden hour settling in, the boy would pull a book from the shelf and sink into a velvet chair by the window. The world outside grew dim, but the room glowed warmly, the spine of each book a muted color in the fading light. He read of faraway places, of knights and explorers of the sea. The stories planted a longing in him, a quiet hunger for something beyond the quiet lawns and neat hedges of Oak Park. Even then, he understood that words, when carefully arranged, could transport a person across oceans without ever leaving the room. The house settled into evening, and the faint scent of dinner drifted up from the kitchen below. Summers at the family's cottage on Walloon Lake in Michigan brought a different kind of peace. The waters stretched out calm and clear, reflecting the blue of the sky and the dark outline of pines along the shore. Mornings there began with the lapping of gentle waves against the wooden dock and the distant call of a loon. Young Ernest would sit on the porch with a fishing rod, not impatient, but perfectly content to watch the cork bob on the surface. The light over the lake was ever-changing, a silver mirror at dawn, a deep sapphire at midday, and then a soft peach as the sun slipped behind the trees. He learned the art of waiting, of letting time pass without resistance. It was here, in the hush of the North Woods, that the idea of a story began to take shape, like a pebble dropping into still water. The village of Oak Park itself was a picture of late 19th century order, with brick-paved streets and churches whose steeples rose against the wide Midwestern sky. Walking home at twilight, the boy would pass under gas lamps just beginning to flicker, their warm halos spilling onto the sidewalk. Neighbors nodded kindly from their porches, and the sound of crickets filled the air. It was a safe, sheltered world, yet within that safety, a restless mind began to imagine the wider world. He watched the trains rumble past the station, their whistles a lonesome sound that beckoned toward Chicago and beyond. The architecture of the town, solid, respectable, unadventurous, would later become something he had to leave behind, but in those early years, it was simply home, a backdrop of quiet stability. Evening in the Hemingway household meant the family gathering in the parlor, the lamps lit, casting a low amber glow over the room. His mother might read aloud, her voice a melodic murmur, while his father dozed in an armchair, a newspaper slipping from his hand. The ticking of the mantel clock marked the slow passage of time, each second a soft heartbeat. Outside, the world grew darker, the elms silhouetted against a navy sky scattered with early stars. The boy would lean his head against the window frame, feeling the cool glass on his skin, already dreaming of the stories he might one day write. He did not yet know the iceberg principle, but he was learning the weight of what remains unspoken, the silence between words, the power of a single, well-chosen detail. In that peaceful domestic glow, the seeds of a master writer were quietly taking root. The last light of summer evenings would linger on the porch, where the family sometimes sat and watched the fireflies blink in the garden. The air carried the sweetness of cut grass and the distant murmur of the street. Young Ernest, half drowsy in his rocking chair, let the scenes of the day drift through his mind like leaves on a stream. He was a boy full of keen observation, storing away the textures of life, the rough bark of an oak, the smooth handle of a fishing rod, the precise shade of his mother's blue dress. Nothing was insignificant. In the quiet dusk of Oak Park, the future author of The Old Man and the Sea was simply a sleepy child, wrapped in the comfortable blanket of a loving home, unaware that his name would one day echo across the world. The stars were coming out, one by one, and the house at 339 North Oak Park Avenue settled into the profound stillness of night. Paris in the 1920s was a city of soft gray light and the constant murmur of the Seine slipping under old stone bridges. For the young Hemingway, newly arrived with his wife Hadley, the mornings belonged to the cafés. He would rise early in their small apartment on the Rue du Cardinal Lemoyne, a narrow street near the Place de la Contrescarpe, and step out into the cool, damp air. The cobblestones were still wet from the night's rain, and the smell of baking bread drifted from a boulangerie around the corner. He walked past shuttered shop fronts, his worn leather notebook tucked under his arm, heading toward his favorite table at a café on the Place Saint-Michel. The city was just waking, the zinc-topped bars being wiped down, the first cups of café crème being set out on marble tabletops. There was a quiet expectancy in the air, as if the whole day were waiting to be written. At the café, he would order a café au lait and open his notebook. The chairs were woven wicker, slightly creaky, and the morning light filtered through the plane trees that lined the boulevard. The sounds around him were gentle, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, the low chatter of the waiters, the distant bell of a tram. Hemingway wrote slowly, in longhand, using a pencil because he liked the way the graphite bit into the paper. He described the way the light fell on the white apron workers, the pigeons strutting on the cobbles, the zinc bar reflecting a pale glow. He was training himself to capture the truth of a moment, the thing itself, without ornament. This quiet discipline, practiced every morning in a café chair, became the foundation of his iceberg principle. The words on the page were just the visible tip. Beneath them lay layers of experience and emotion, unspoken but deeply felt. After writing, he might stroll through the Luxembourg Gardens, a short walk up the hill. The formal gardens were a geometry of gravel paths, chestnut trees, and flower beds laid out with quiet precision. Old men played bowls under the shade, and nurses pushed white baby carriages along the sun-dappled lanes. The Medici fountain was a still pool where goldfish drifted lazily, and the sound of water trickling over mossy stone created a sense of timeless calm. Hemingway would find an iron chair by the pond, light a cigarette, and simply watch. He loved the gardens in the early afternoon, when the light turned golden and long shadows stretched across the lawns. Everything here was orderly, peaceful, a world away from the chaos of the war he had seen. The gardens allowed his mind to wander, to process the stories he was shaping, to let the deeper currents of his work settle inside him. The heart of the lost generation beat in the salons and bookshops of the left bank. Gertrude Stein's apartment on the Rue de Fleuris was a gathering place, its walls crowded with modern paintings, Picassos, Matisses that glowed with strange, vibrant colors. In the evening, the lamps would be lit, and the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace mingled with the aroma of strong tea. Hemingway would sit quietly, listening to Stein's deep, measured voice as she talked about art and writing. Her walls of canvases, the polished floors, the large windows looking onto a peaceful courtyard, all created an atmosphere of intellectual warmth. There was no drama here, only the slow exchange of ideas among painters and poets who were trying to remake the world with words and images. These evenings were gentle, filled with silences and the thoughtful turn of conversation. For Hemingway, it was a kind of university, an education in seeing differently, in reducing language to its purest form. Sylvia Beach's bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, on the Rue de l'Odéon, was another quiet sanctuary. The narrow store was lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines like a patchwork quilt of faded colors. The dusty, papery smell of old volumes mixed with the faint scent of the oil stove in the corner. Hemingway would browse the shelves for hours, pulling down volumes of Turgenev or Joyce, feeling the weight of each book in his hands. The shop was often hushed, with only the rustle of pages and the ticking of a clock. Sunlight fell in soft rectangles through the small paned windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. It was here that he borrowed books, read hungrily, and found in other writers the validation of his own lean, stripped-down style. The bookshop was a place of quiet encouragement, a warm, dim cave where literature was alive and breathing. The winters in Paris were cold, and the Hemingway's apartment was often poorly heated. On such days, Ernest would take his work to a different kind of café, one with a large stove in the center of the room and steamed-up windows. He would sit close to the fire, the warmth soaking into his bones, his notebook open on the wooden table. The coffee would grow cold as he wrote, but he barely noticed. The story absorbed him completely. He worked on the early stories that would become in our time, paring down every sentence, cutting adverbs, seeking the exact rhythm of a phrase. Outside, the gray sky hung low over the rooftops, and occasionally snow began to fall, silent and slow, muffling the street sounds. The café became a cocoon, a place of pure concentration, where the only things that existed were the pencil, the paper, and the images forming in his mind. Time seemed suspended, measured only by the refilling of his coffee cup. In the evenings, after dinner, Hemingway and Hadley often walked along the Seine, watching the lights of the bateau's mouches reflect on the black water. The river moved slowly, a silver-black ribbon winding through the heart of the city. The bookstalls along the quays were closed, their green metal boxes locked for the night. The Notre Dame Cathedral stood in the distance, its towers silhouetted against a sky that still held a faint lavender glow. The couple walked arm in arm, speaking little, just absorbing the night stillness of Paris. It was a simple life, built on routine and companionship and the steady discipline of storytelling. The day's writing, the garden stroll, the warm café, these were the bricks of Hemingway's world. Each morning, he returned to the blank page, ready to chip away at the marble block of language, revealing only the necessary, leaving the rest to shimmer beneath the surface like the hidden depths of a river. At night, back in their flat, the world shrank to the warm circle of lamplight on a wooden desk. Hemingway would reread what he had written, his lips moving slightly, testing each syllable. The window was cracked open just a little, letting in the far-off sound of laughter from a bistro, the clatter of a horse's hooves. The room was spare, a bed, a table, a few books, but it was enough. He believed in stripping away the unnecessary, in art as in life. As the lamp burned low and the gaslight outside flickered, he set the pencil down and looked out at the rooftops of the Latin Quarter. They were a slate-gray geometric puzzle under the night sky. He knew, in those moments, that he was learning to write truly, to make sentences that were as strong and clean as a bridge of steel. The city slept around him, and the pages of tomorrow's notebook already whispered their quiet promise. Far from the gray skies of Paris, another world of light and water opened before Ernest Hemingway when he arrived in Key West in the late 1920s. The island lay at the very tip of the Florida Keys, a coral outpost where the Gulf Stream washed warm, crystalline waters against the shore. The town was a sleepy collection of wooden houses, palm trees, and the endless sound of wind in the coconut fronds. Hemingway found a house at 907 Whitehead Street, a two-story Spanish colonial built of native limestone, with wide verandas and shuttered windows painted dark green. The garden was a riot of tropical foliage, hibiscus, bougainvillea, giant ferns that thrived in the humid air. Mornings there began with the crowing of roosters and the soft, filtered light that slanted through the slats of the jalousie windows. It was a place of deep, unhurried peace, where the clock seemed to run slower, adjusted to the rhythm of the tides. The house became a sanctuary for his writing. On the second floor, in a room that overlooked the garden and, beyond it, the street, he set up a simple desk. He wrote standing up, placing his typewriter on a tall bookshelf, his pencil and paper always within reach. The room was sparsely furnished, but the windows were open to the crossbreeze, carrying the scent of salt and flowers. He rose at first light, while the air was still cool, and worked until noon, the tapping of the keys a steady, meditative sound. Outside, his famous six-toed cats slowly stretched and padded across the porch, their paws soft against the wooden floor. The cats were descendants of a white polydactyl cat named Snowball, a gift from a ship's captain. They became as much a part of the house as the coral walls, drifting through the rooms like little ghosts of the tropics, lending the home an air of quiet, feline watchfulness. The real pull of Key West, however, was the sea. The water here was a palette of blues, turquoise near the shore, deepening to a rich indigo where the Gulf Stream ran. Hemingway's boat, the Pilar, a 38-foot cabin cruiser painted black and green, bobbed gently at the harbor, ready to take him out onto the Gulf. The fishing trips were not dramatic pursuits, but slow, patient days spent drifting under the wide dome of the sky. The deck was warm underfoot, and the only sounds were the slap of waves against the hull and the cry of a distant frigate bird. Hemingway would sit in the fighting chair, a weathered wooden seat, watching the lines trail out behind the boat. The sun climbed slowly, and the hours stretched into a gentle blur of light and water. He was never more at peace than when he was at sea, alone with the immense, silent presence of the Gulf, the surface giving away nothing of its hidden life. The marina at dusk was a quiet spectacle. After a day on the water, the Pilar would motor slowly back to the dock, its engine a low, throaty murmur. The setting sun turned the sky into a canvas of peach, coral, and soft violet. Pelicans perched on the pilings, their beaks tucked, while fishermen cleaned their catch on wooden stalls, the scales sparkling like tiny mirrors. Hemingway would tie up the boat, his hands moving slowly, deliberately. The chatter of the dock hands was a low, friendly murmur. He would walk home through the streets of Old Key West, past clapboard houses painted in faded pastels, their porches lit by the warm glow of hurricane lanterns. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant strum of a guitar. Every step felt like a return to a primordial calm, a leaving behind of the complicated world of literary fame and city noise. Inside the Whitehead Street house, the evening light filled the living room with a golden, honeyed hue. The floors were of dark polished wood, the furniture heavy and comfortable. The walls were decorated with mementos from Spain and Africa, a bullfighting poster, a carved wooden mask, a portrait of a soldier. But the atmosphere was not one of action. It was one of quiet reflection, a museum of experiences now settled into tranquility. Hemingway would pour a small glass of whiskey, add water from the dripstone fountain in the corner, and sit in a worn leather chair. The cats would curl at his feet. He read or simply gazed out the window at the bamboo swaying in the night breeze. The house had a particular quiet at that hour, broken only by the whisper of the ceiling fan and the distant boom of surf. The writing he produced during those Key West years carried the flavor of the sea into every paragraph. It was at this desk that he completed A Farewell to Arms and later worked on many stories set under the bright, harsh light of the tropics. But the process itself remained slow, a careful chiseling away of excess. The Gulf Stream outside his window became a metaphor for his art, the visible surface smooth and serene, the hidden currents vast and powerful. He would write a sentence, then stare out at the palm trees for long minutes, searching for the one true word. The principle of omission, the dignity of the unsaid, was a lesson the sea taught him each day. It held back its depths, showing only the play of light on waves, yet everyone felt the massive weight beneath. So too, his stories implied far more than they stated, their power residing in the calm. On clear nights, Hemingway would sometimes walk alone to the old fort at the edge of town, where the continent truly ended and the vast Atlantic stretched toward Africa. The stars in the Key West sky were exceptionally bright, undimmed by any city glare. He stood on the coral ramparts, listening to the water whisper against the rocks far below. The lighthouse beams swept across the darkness in a slow, regular arc, its white flash illuminating the palms for a brief, ghostly instant. He thought of old men and the sea, of the dignity of struggle, of the simple, enduring virtues of courage and patience. In that immense nocturnal quiet, with the salt spray faint on his lips, he was a long way from Oak Park and Paris. Yet he was home. The island, the boat, the house with its cats, the eternal rhythm of the tides, they had woven themselves into his very soul, and would live forever in the spare, shining prose of his best work. Spain entered Hemingway's life not as a land of conflict, but as a landscape of profound, sun-drenched stillness. His first journeys there in the 1920s took him beyond the cities and into the broad, empty heart of the country, the Meseta of Castile, a high plateau where the sky is immense and the earth stretches to every horizon without interruption. The road wound slowly between fields of pale gold wheat, dotted here and there with olive groves whose silver-green leaves shimmered when the wind stirred. The villages were clusters of whitewashed houses, their terracotta roofs baking in the afternoon heat, while a single church tower stood vigil over the silence. Hemingway traveled by train and bus, watching the landscape unfold through the window like a slow, patient scroll. The train compartments were wooden and worn, the seats polished by countless journeys, and the light that fell through the dusty glass was thick with the color of honey. He loved the early morning in those small Spanish towns. The plaza would be nearly empty, save for a few old men sitting on iron benches, their canes resting between their knees. The fountain in the center trickled softly, and the sound of water mingled with the cooing of doves hidden in the eaves of the arcade. The cobbles still held the coolness of the night, and the first light painted long, bluish shadows across the stone. Hemingway would step into a café that smelled of freshly ground coffee and anise, order a small cup of thick, black coffee, and simply watch. The waiter moved silently, wiping the marble counter with a cloth. The ritual of the morning was unhurried, sacred. In these moments, he felt the deep, ancient rhythm of the country, a tempo set not by clocks, but by the slow arc of the sun across the wide Andalusian sky. The Dehesa, the wooded pasture land in the south, was a realm of shadow and dappled light. Home oaks, ancient and gnarled, stood scattered across the grassland like patient old men. Black Iberian pigs rooted peacefully under the trees, their shapes dark against the pale dry grass. The air smelled of wild thyme and sun-warmed bark. Hemingway walked for miles through these landscapes, often alone, a leather canteen slung over his shoulder. The path was soft with dust and pine needles, muffling his footsteps. In the distance, a ruined castle might rise on a hilltop, its walls the same color as the earth. There was no drama in this land, only a great, enduring quiet. It was a place where the mind could empty itself, where the noise of modern life fell away completely. He understood why people had lived here for thousands of years, why the land imposed its own slow, deliberate pace on the body and the soul. The corrida, or bullfight, was, for Hemingway, a deeply ritualized event, but it is the setting, not the action, that glowed in his memory. The Plaza de Toros in a town like Ronda, a white stone ring perched on the edge of a deep gorge, was a masterpiece of architecture and light. On the afternoon of a corrida, the sun divided the arena into a perfect contrast of sun and shadow, sol y sombra. The crowd arrived without hurry, settling into their stone seats, the murmur of voices echoing off the high walls. The band would play a slow passatable, the notes drifting into the hot air. Hemingway watched the spectacle, yes, but his eye always returned to the quality of the light on the sand, the slow drift of cloud shadows across the stands, the way a lace mantilla framed a woman's face. He absorbed the aesthetics, the ceremony, the deep cultural gravity, weaving the atmosphere later into his prose, where the scent of cigar smoke and the drone of flies in the summer heat became as important as any spoken word. The Sierra de Guadarrama, north of Madrid, offered a different kind of serenity. Here, the mountains rose cool and pine-clad above the scorched plain. The air was thin and crisp, smelling of resin and snowmelt. Hemingway would sometimes retreat to a small village in the foothills, staying in a stone inn with heavy wooden beams and a fireplace that was lit even in the summer evenings. Walking along the mountain trails, he would hear the distant tinkle of goat bells, the rush of a stream over pebbles. The light at that altitude was crystalline, sharpening every edge of the granite peaks against an impossibly blue sky. Sit quietly on a rock, let the sun warm his face, and feel the profound peace of the high places. It was a landscape that demanded no words, a counterbalance to the social intensity of Paris or the literary feuds of New York. Here, he could simply be, a small figure in a vast, indifferent, but beautiful natural world. In Granada, the gardens of the Alhambra became a recurring dream. The Generalife's terrace gardens were a masterpiece of water and green. Narrow channels of water ran beside stone pathways, fed by ancient aqueducts, their surface reflecting the cypress trees and the clear sky above. Roses and myrtle lined the paths, their scent heavy and sweet in the afternoon sun. Hemingway loved to wander here in the quiet of the late afternoon, watching the water flow in its precise, unhurried way. The sound was a soft, constant murmur, a cooling presence in the Andalusian heat. The architecture, the carved stucco, the horseshoe arches, the delicate tracery of geometric patterns, was a testament to a civilization that valued contemplation and beauty. Sitting in a shaded courtyard, listening to the fountain play, he felt the weight of history as something gentle, a layered quiet rather than a burden. The experience settled into his aesthetic sensibilities, influencing his understanding of form and restraint. All these Spanish landscapes found expression not in grand declarations, but in the quiet spaces of his work. The sun setting over the olive groves, the cold taste of water from an earthenware jug, the dusty road that stretched into the shimmering distance, these became the hidden ballast of his iceberg. The novel The Sun Also Rises is full of this atmosphere. The train ride through the Basques country, the trout stream cool under pines, the slow climb to the peak at Roncesvalles. In his writing, Spain is not a backdrop of violent action, but a sensory world of textures and light. His descriptions embrace the feel of a leather wine boda, the sight of a shepherd's distant figure against the evening sky, the precise quality of a shadow on a whitewashed wall. By focusing on these quiet, eternal details, he made the country live in the reader's mind with an intensity that no plot could achieve. The land was his silent teacher, whispering the truth that less is always more. As evening fell over any Spanish town, the light would soften into a golden haze, the outlines of buildings blurring slightly. The bells of the church would ring the Angelus, their slow, regular strokes rolling out over the rooftops and across the fields. People emerged for the paseo, the gentle evening stroll, walking slowly around the plaza, talking in soft voices. The air cooled, and the smell of olive oil and grilling food drifted from kitchen windows. Hemingway would take his place at an outdoor table, order a glass of chilled Fino sherry, and let the tranquil rhythm of the evening wash over him. The stars appeared, one by one, incredibly sharp in the pure dark sky. He was content, a mere observer, a guest in a land that embodied the dignity and simplicity he strove for in his art. The night was quiet, and the next day promised only more light, more stillness, and the slow, patient work of observing the world and setting down its truth. The villa perched on a hillside in the sleepy outer district of San Francisco de Paula, looking down toward the far-off shimmer of Havana and the Florida Strait. Finca Vigía, the lookout farm, became Ernest Hemingway's home in 1939, a place of refuge and enduring peace where he would live for the next 2 decades. The house was a one-story Spanish colonial, airy and open, painted a soft cream that glowed warmly under the tropical sun. Wide verandas wrapped around it, their railings draped with bougainvillea in magenta and white. A ceiba tree, massive and sacred, spread its dense green canopy over the lawn. The air was always alive with the hum of bees and the quiet rustle of palm fronds. In the early morning, as the sun rose over the eastern hills, the whole property seemed to float in a golden mist, the world still and fresh, washed by the night's quiet. It was the perfect place for a writer who craved isolation and a slow, deliberate rhythm of daily life. The center of his work at the finca was a 3-story tower that stood separate from the main house, reached by a winding path through the garden. The torre, as it was called, was a square, ivory-white structure with a study on the ground floor and a bedroom above, the topmost level an open platform with a view to the sea. Hemingway would walk out there just after dawn, a cup of strong coffee in hand, the tile floor cool on his bare feet. The study was a sanctuary of disciplined creativity. It was not large, but every object had its place. The heavy wooden desk against the wall, the shelves of books in several languages, the antelope head he had brought back from Africa, frozen in a glassy stare. The typewriter sat on a wooden stand, waiting. The windows faced the trade winds, and the sound they made through the slatted blinds was a constant, soft exhale. Here, in this high, quiet room, the masterpieces of his later years took shape. The garden that sloped down from the tower was a flourishing, slightly wild paradise. Mango and avocado trees dropped their ripe fruit onto the grass. A small swimming pool, fed by a natural spring, reflected the blue sky and the overhanging branches of a flamboyant tree aflame with orange blossoms. Hemingway liked to swim alone in the early afternoon, the water cool and clear, the silence broken only by the splash of his strokes and the distant crow of a rooster. After swimming, he would lie on a reed lounge on the patio, letting the sun dry his skin, a manuscript or a letter resting on his chest. The hours passed with a liquid slowness. The finca cats, dozens of them, all descended from the original snowball line, slinked through the undergrowth or lounged on the warm stones of the terrace, their eyes half closed in contentment. They were his quiet companions, guardians of the peace. During those years, the Havana fishing village of Cojamar, a short drive down the coast, became his second world. The Pilar, which he had sailed across from Key West, was moored in its small harbor. At sunrise, the village was a gentle, timeless place. Wooden fishing boats painted in faded blues and reds bobbed on the gentle swell, their nets hung out to dry like dark webs. The men, weathered and serene, mended their lines in silence, nodding to Hemingway as he passed. He would stop at the little terrace of La Terraza restaurant, right on the waterfront, for a cup of café con leche. The sea spread out before him, a sheet of hammered silver in the early light. These were the waters where the old men fished for marlin and where the story of Santiago would one day be born. But the story came not in a flash, but in slow accumulation: a face, a worn pair of hands, the color of the deep Gulf Stream, all observed in the peaceful, repetitive rhythm of the harbor. Inside the finca, the living room was a high-ceilinged gallery of memory. Natural light flooded through tall windows, falling onto dark hardwood floors and a grand fireplace that was never lit in the tropic heat. The walls displayed the trophies of a life, but arranged without boastfulness: a collection of old maps, a painting by Joan Moreau, the horns of a bull mounted above a doorway. Yet the room was not cluttered. The spaces between these objects were filled with air and light, giving a sense of calm expanse. Hemingway would sit in a heavy armchair, his reading glasses low on his nose, scanning through the day's newspapers or a new novel. The mantelpiece clock ticked softly. Outside, the gardener slowly raked the fallen leaves, the sound a distant, rhythmic scrape. In the late afternoon, the sunlight deepened, painting long rectangles of amber on the floor, and the house seemed to breathe a quiet, contented sigh. It was a place where time was measured not in deadlines, but in the ripening of fruit and the slow course of the sun across the sky. The genesis of the old man and the sea was rooted in this Cuban landscape, in the patience of the fishermen and the majesty of the Gulf. He wrote it in a burst of creative energy in 1951, but the material had been marinating for years. The novella grew out of the daily life he witnessed: the old men sitting on the terrace at Cojamar, their sun-browned skin, their silent dignity in the face of loss or fortune. Up in the Torre, he channeled that quiet strength into the story of Santiago. The writing itself followed the Iceberg principle more purely than ever. The language was stripped to bare essentials, every word chosen for its weight and truth. The story of a single old man and a fish contained an entire philosophy, yet never spoke it aloud. Like the sea from the lookout tower, the surface was simple, beautiful, drenched in light, while beneath moved the great unseen currents of human endurance and grace. As evening approached, the finca entered its most magical hour. The sun set behind the western ridge, and the sky turned a deep, dusky lavender. From the veranda, Hemingway could see the far-off lights of Havana beginning to twinkle, tiny golden pinpricks against the darkening landscape. The air cooled and smelled of night-blooming jasmine. He would pour a small glass of wine or whiskey, add a splash of water, and sit in a rocking chair, watching the geckos emerge on the walls, frozen in their hunt. The bats began their silent, flittering patrol over the pool. He often stayed there until full dark, the dome of stars blazing above the palms, so bright and close they seemed almost tangible. The solitude was total, but not lonely. It was filled with the presence of the cats, the distant murmur of the radios from the servants' quarters, and the vast, breathing quiet of the tropical night. This was the peace he had sought all his life, the stillness out of which great stories grew. The Finca Vigía years were his long, final homecoming to the self he wanted to be. In the mornings, the tower study was filled with the sound of typing. In the afternoons, the pool reflected the blue sky. In the evenings, the veranda held a man at rest, a drink in hand, looking out over the dark island. The world's storm seemed very far away. Here, in the soft breezes and the rustle of the flame tree, Hemingway found the sustained quiet that allowed him to produce his last masterwork. The house, the garden, the cats, the view of the sea, these were not mere backdrops, but essential parts of the writing itself, woven into the texture of his prose. When you read the opening lines of The Old Man and the Sea, you are reading the light of a Cuban morning and the patient silence of the Tory. It is the voice of a man who learned, at last, to sit still and listen to the world, and to write only what was necessary, leaving the vast, invisible iceberg of meaning to gleam below the surface. Long after the houses and the boats and the cafés have faded into memory, what remains of Ernest Hemingway is the quality of his silence, the words he chose not to write. He called it the iceberg principle, but it was more a philosophy of looking than a mere literary technique. Imagine a vast, deep blue ocean at twilight, the surface glassy and almost black, and rising from it the luminous white form of an iceberg. Only an eighth floats visible. The rest descends into hidden depths, massive and unseen. So it is with a true story. The writer omits the load-bearing foundation, the submerged volumes of life, leaving only the clean, necessary shape above the waterline. This was not a trick of style, but a way of being in the world. He learned it in the quiet observation of nature, in the patience of mornings spent watching the light change on a wall, in the dignity of old men who said little but felt everything. His prose is a gift of space, an invitation to feel the weight beneath each simple sentence. To understand this, one must picture the world as he saw it, a place of immense, quiet beauty best captured with restraint. The sun rising over the Gulf of Mexico does not need many words. A single line about the color of the water and the angle of the light can contain an entire morning. Hemingway taught himself to write by not writing, by sitting still and letting the image saturate his mind until it was saturated with silence. Then, from that silence, he would draw out a few precise words, like a fisherman pulling a single perfect fish from the deep. The rest, the millions of years of geology that shaped that underwater mountain, the history of all the men who ever sailed that sea would be known in the reader's bones without ever being spelled out. This is the opposite of noise. This is the lullaby of the omitted, the strength of the unspoken. His writing desk, wherever it traveled, Paris, Key West, Cuba, Ketchum, was always a space of monastic simplicity. There were no clutter, no distractions, just blank paper, a pencil, a typewriter. He stood in front of the page as if before a window, looking out onto the landscape he intended to paint. Each day began with the same ritual: read what was written the day before, pause for a long moment, then write one true sentence. The sentence had to be something solid, something he knew for sure. From that single true stone, he built a path into the narrative. The process was slow, sometimes yielding only a handful of paragraphs in a morning's work. But each paragraph was dense with omission, balanced on the invisible architecture that lay beneath. The writer's job was not to describe emotion, but to create the conditions under which emotion arises naturally in the reader, as mist rises from a lake at dawn. The natural world was his great teacher in this method. A river does not explain why it flows, it simply moves, its surface revealing the shape of the hidden rocks beneath. A forest does not declare its age, it is there, in the thickness of the trunks and the deep litter of leaves. Hemingway's stories borrow this same elemental reticence. When we read of Santiago alone on the sea, feeling the line pull in his hands, we are not told of his heroic endurance. We are shown the burning of the sun on his neck, the taste of raw tuna, the purple threads of the man-of-war floating by. These concrete details are the visible tip of the iceberg. Below them, carrying them, is everything Hemingway knew about suffering, about dignity, about the human place in the indifferent vastness of nature. He erases himself as narrator, and the story becomes as clean and severe and beautiful as a bleached bone on a beach. Think of the evenings he spent alone in a small boat, drifting on the Gulf Stream under a sky full of stars. The water was black and clear, and the phosphorescence sparked like handfuls of diamonds whenever a fish stirred. He would cut the engine and let the boat drift, feeling the immense solitude of the sea. In such moments, words felt like an intrusion. The true experience was the silence, the single cry of a night bird, the slight breathing of the wind. To translate that experience onto the page required a radical discipline, to include only what deepened the silence, not what broke it. So his sentences became shorter, the adjectives fewer, the spaces between paragraphs wider. A Hemingway paragraph often ends not with a conclusion, but with an image that hangs in the mind like a sustained note. The effect, for the reader, is a quiet kind of awe, the feeling of having looked into something deep and real without having been force-fed a meaning. The iceberg principle is, in the end, an act of trust. It trusts the reader to feel what is not said. It trusts the material, the landscape, the dialogue of common people, the simple facts of a journey, to carry profound weight without explanation. This is why his work endures as a comfort to so many. In a noisy world, his stories offer a deep place of stillness. They do not shout or argue. They present a lake and a boat and a sun beating down and leave us alone with them. The reader brings their own hidden depths to meet the story's hidden depths, and in that meeting, a strange, quiet grace occurs. This is the iceberg's gift. It shows us that what is most powerful is often most quiet, and that the deepest truths do not need to be spoken to be known. Now, as the darkness deepens and the last light fades from memory, imagine a high northern sea in winter. A great iceberg drifts under a sky full of cold, silent stars. Its surface is carved into smooth, pale blue ridges by the slow work of wind and water. Below, in the dark, the ice descends for hundreds of feet, a ghost mountain heavier than the world above can measure. The sea laps gently at its edges. Nothing stirs except the slow drift of time. That iceberg is a perfect image of a Hemingway story, pure, essential, radiant with what is left out. It asks nothing of you but your attention, your willingness to sit quietly beside it and feel the immense, reverberating silence of what lies beneath. And as you watch it, you may find your own breathing slows, your thoughts settle, and you drift, not into sleep, but into that dreamlike state between waking and slumber, where the words of the book dissolve and only the feeling remains, calm, whole, and deeply at peace.